Welcome to this ILERA2020 session on teaching strategies for making labor and employment relations courses relevant in an area of perceived irrelevance. Sorry for the distractions. Somebody inadvertently turned some lights off down here. So this is the technical elements of this meeting are being facilitated by Sandy's Turkey. Thank you for your assistance. As she already indicated, that this session is being recorded for ILERA and will be placed on the YouTube channel after the conference. So, please keep that in mind when you're making your presentations or when you're asking a question. If there is something that's more sensitive, we could pause the recording, but just keep that in mind. We ask that everybody stay muted except when you're speaking in order to not be disruptive to the presenters and also to facilitate a cleaner recording. We have 4 presentations, and so we will start with each of those in the order that they are in the program. And each presenter or presentation team has 15 minutes max. If you're a little bit short of that, even better. That will leave more time for question and answers. If you're getting close to the time, I'll send you a chat at the last minute, but for the most part, I'll hope that you'll just police yourselves fairly well. Of course, if this is probably the standing joke of all virtual conferences now, right? Of course, if push comes to shove, we can just mute you and move on, but of course, we won't need to resort to that. For those of you in the audience or presenters to talk with each other, which of course is welcome as well, when the time comes, you can raise your hand using that function, or you can ask a question in the chat. But let's start with the presentations. And again, we'll just go in the order that they're in the program. So we're going to start with Johanna Weststar, who deserves our particular thanks for being one of the co-organizers of this conference, which I'm sure has been tons more work than she signed up for, given all of the pandemic-related accommodations. So thanks very much on behalf of everyone for that, Johanna. And she is here to talk to us today about core principles, contemporary examples, and hands-on work.
Great, thanks very much, John. And it is very much thanks to others on the panel. I think maybe starting with Doug, I think that there was a ILERA dialogue thread at some point that seems very long ago now, where people were chatting about teaching strategies in IR, and the timing seemed right to incorporate it into this conference, and John really ran with the idea. So thanks everyone for making this happen. My presentation is kind of a hodgepodge of just some things that I have done or tried in the classroom that seem to work out okay. And so I thought I would just share them. There's no particular strategy really, but just sort of share them as ideas and some of the things I focus on. And I really look forward to the discussion that we might have in this session and also in the next one tomorrow. So just some context for you. There's only one industrial and labor relations course in my unit, or therefore at my university, and it's just called Industrial and Labor Relations. It's a pitched as a third-year course, but of course we get a lot of fourth years in it as well. The students are coming from a management and organizational studies program that is embedded in the Faculty of Social Science. So I'm not in a business school, which does change the environment a little bit because the students do have the option, and many of them do, take a number of their electives across other social science disciplines like political science, sociology, anthropology, geography. So sometimes they have a slightly broader flavor to their background, and that can be oftentimes is useful and interesting in the classroom. Most of the students that I get in my class are focusing on a human resource management specialization, and I find that most HRM textbooks, at least the Canadian ones, but also the the way HR courses are approached in my university and in my department are relatively uncritical of, the sort of managerialist perspective of work and employment. And so what I try to do in this course, because the course inherently lends itself to it, but also because of my own orientation to the subject matter, is sort of bring a little bit more of the worker perspective to the fore, because in all their other courses, compensation, training, recruitment, HR planning, they're getting a lot of that that managerialist perspective. So that's kind of the flavor of what's going on in my classroom. It's usually, the course is capped at 50 students, so there's some ability to do some interesting things. I would say just in general that I try to approach the course focusing at various times and in various ways on kind of these 6 core principles. So I want to spend a lot of time talking with the students about power, because that's something that is often pretty invisible in the mainstream HR discussions. So we do spend time talking about the workplace as a contested space, power imbalances in the workplace, inherent differences. I should say I typically use John Goddard's textbook for the course, which is a little bit more critically oriented in general. So along with power, I try to bring up issues of equity as much as possible in examples, and focusing on how there are sort of gaps in managerialist approaches in terms of equity, but also in terms of the sense of universal laws, that there is an uneven playing field. And arguably, I think I could bring more of that in terms of specific examples. Citizenship tends to play a fairly large role. I myself do research on the digital game industry, the video game industry, and a lens that I use for that is talking about citizenship at work and whether these workers have agency in their workplaces. So I bring some of that in and try to express with students and engage in a dialogue with them about how workplaces are a bit weird in a democratic society, because we put such stake in a democratic society, and yet workplaces are pretty inherently undemocratic. So that's a theme. Voice, it wouldn't be surprising that would be a theme, and sort of trying to frame voice as something that's maybe a little bit more natural seeming than heretical in a workplace. Talking about collectivism, again, collectivism is something that's not inherently bad, and sometimes it's often very good. And then also trying to emphasize to students that one of the things that's so interesting about this field is that it changes all the time. So laws change, societies change, economies change, politicians change, and that makes it quite dynamic, and sort of trying to instill that. So those are maybe my sort of guiding pillars as I decide what I'm going to talk about, what exercises we're going to do, etc. So some of those examples. One thing that I've done for the last number of years, and it usually sets kind of an interesting first stage, is have a little discussion. It's the first thing I do in the first class. And I start by kind of ordering some students around. So it's a bit of a risk because, you know, some students might think it's very weird. I don't get them to do strange things. I usually, you know, if someone's wearing a ball hat, I'll tell them to take it off. If someone has a laptop open, I'll tell them to close it. I'll ask a student to move where they're sitting and go sit over here instead. And for the most part, they all just do it right away. And so then I tell them, okay, go back to how you were. Open your computer, put your hat on, go back to where you were sitting. And then I just say to them, what happened there? And it doesn't take them very long to say, well, you know, you asked us to do these things, so we did them. And why is that? And it's because I'm in charge. So then we have a conversation about what that means. And so, I explicitly kind of then ask them about the power dynamic that we have going on in our classroom. Who has the power? They say, I do. Why do I have the power? What gives me that power? What attributes? I'm standing at the front of the room. I'm standing, they're sitting. I have a PhD, they don't, right? So we go through kind of a range of just examples that the students bring forward about what are the things that give a person power, and why does that come to be? And then we sort of segue from that into a discussion of, okay, so given that I'm the boss, right? So if we relate that now to a workplace in a way, if I'm your boss, if you're unhappy with me and with something that I'm doing in this class, what are you going to do? And they go through the examples that they do, right? Well, I'll talk to you after class. I'll send you an email. Maybe I'll come to your office hours. And we sort of deconstruct those, and they land pretty quickly. And we have a pretty frank conversation about how I still am in power in all of those circumstances, right? If they come to my office to have a one-on-one meeting with me, that's my house, right? They're in my domain. They're at a disadvantage, and we talk through that, and we usually end up getting to the point where we get to, okay, if I don't listen to you, then what do you do? And then they do start talking about, well, how could they escalate? Do they go to the chair of the department? Do they go to the dean? Do they file an appeal? Do they get together with their fellow students and they start talking in a group? And then we get onto this idea of, okay, power as an individual versus a collective. So that's just where we start. And I think that is jarring for many of them because it's not what they're expecting in a class in the HR module, but it allows them to really first ground some of the experiences that we're going to have in the discussions for the rest of the term in their own experience, if they think that the classroom is maybe not so different from a workplace. So that's one of the things that seems to have worked okay. Another thing that I've started doing just over the last couple of years is again around this unpacking of power. And so usually the discussion of power in our classroom then is a good segue into introducing this first assignment. And this is the first kind of written assignment that I have students do, at least in the current manifestation of the course. And it's really taken from this book, The Secrets of a Successful Organizer, which was published by Labor Notes. That is, some of you may have seen it, but it's a handbook for organizers, right? And it's big text and very few words, so it's quite accessible. And it's kind of a how-to about how do you start organizing your workplace. And there's a section in it that's all about power mapping and figuring out where are the existing social relationships in your workplace that you could then leverage for an organizing effort. And it, of course, is written completely in terms of organizing your workplace, but we could also think about it in terms of organizing for any other reason. So what I get students to do in the assignment is to select a workplace that they know well, ideally their own, if they are working, and many of them do have jobs, or they just had a summer job or something like that. Or if they really have no exposure to a workplace, I suggest that maybe they just kind of interview their parent or guardian for this assignment, or a sibling, or maybe their roommate, someone that they can kind of interrogate about that workplace. And so the assignment is that they have to identify all of the people in their workplace. If it's a super large one, I tell them just focus on a department just so it doesn't get unwieldy. And I get them to actually physically map out the workplace. So they produce a schematic map of the physical layout, and they indicate where everybody sits. Some workplaces people don't sit, so they indicate where people flow across the workplace. Where does the work flow? Where do people congregate? Stuff like that. And then they also start noting where are the groups? Who hangs out together, and why do they hang out together? Do they hang out because their work is similar, or are they hanging out in social groups? So they do this kind of detailed analysis of their space. And then they use those maps to answer these questions that I have on the slide that are really about who are the leaders, who's influential, what makes them influential? Do they have formal power or do they have informal power? And what does that mean for how those groups interact with other groups? And the last question in the assignment is, if you were to organize those workers, not necessarily into a union, but even just, you know, if you just wanted everyone to get together to do something, how would you go about doing it? And it usually leads the students to talk about, you know, putting posters in prominent spaces in the workplace, or, well, I'm going to go talk to Sally first because everybody listens to Sally. So if I get Sally on board, then we're good to go. And so again, it's just a way for them to sort of dive right into figuring out how workplaces are these sources or sites of power relationships, and how that actually is manifesting around them all the time, and they may not be aware. And most times the students come out of that exercise by saying, I never looked at my workplace like this before. I had no idea half of these relationships or connections were even here. And it also makes them operate and do a job that union organizers are doing all the time and activists are doing all the time. So it kind of puts them in that space and starts them seeing that, well, maybe this is not something that only you know, crazy radicals do to understand their workplaces. So that's an assignment that's gone well. And some students are amazing, right? They bring me these huge Bristol board displays of their workplace, or they've made charts and graphs, and some of them really go to town on it, which is always gratifying from an instructor's perspective. Just in general, so I mentioned I study the digital game industry. I usually try to toss in examples from my research and from the game industry wherever they seem pertinent. We don't do anything specifically around this industry, but the students think it's sexy and interesting because the industry is glamorous. So that sometimes helps to use examples that don't feel like traditional sources of where we would talk about labor relations or where we would talk about unions. These are more contemporary spaces that the students can identify with sometimes a little bit better. There's another activity that I've done with the class for the past number of years. So in the Goddard textbook, there's a whole section that talks about the roles and functions of unions. So unions can play economic roles, they can play democratization roles, etc. And you know, those words are very academic, and they often are really abstract. And so I like to try to encourage the students to sort of figure out what those words mean in terms of practical examples. And instead of giving them to the students, usually we just do this in class. They all tend to have laptops or a phone. And I ask them just to go on the UFCW website. And I picked that union in particular because it does a lot of different things. It's a pretty diverse union. And it has some interesting campaigns around, you know, Walmart and around migrant workers in particular. And I sort of roped this into a broader discussion of migrant workers because the UFCW sponsored a video that is Vincenzo Pietropalo. He's an activist photographer, and he wrote this book, Harvest Pilgrims, that's all photographs that he took of migrant farm workers in Ontario and Canada. And where we are in London is not that far away from, well, we're sort of in an agricultural heartland there. So there are lots of migrant workers in the surrounding areas. And that's illuminating. And then we can kind of segue into, well, you know, what is the UFCW doing around supporting a lot of these workers? And so the unions the students are asked to just browse the UFCW website. They can do it in pairs or small groups for 10 minutes or so, and just try to come up with an example from what you see on that website of each of these things in our textbook, which are possible things that unions can do. And there's, you know, more than enough examples. And I find it brings some realism to that union role, and really encourages the students to dig into the practicalities of unions. And again, they see a lot of things that unions do that they didn't know that they did, right? They know that unions might go do collective bargaining. They know that a union might result in a strike, but do they know that, unions help organize bike drives where they give bicycles to migrant workers? Well, maybe not, right? Do they know that unions have scholarship funds, et cetera, et cetera? So then that leads into a broader conversation around the things that unions do or the things that unions try to do. Sometimes we can also talk about whether they're successful or not in different spaces. So just a little bit, more in terms of migrant workers, it allows a discussion. Yeah.
Sorry, is this your last example or?
It is, yeah.
Okay.
And I was just going to lead into the fact that I think in terms of relevancy, our title of this seems maybe a little old because now with the pandemic, some of these topics might be more relevant, and migrant workers in particular, but also just around many other workers that students can now identify with in different ways. So I haven't done a lot in this space, but I think my teaching will evolve and try to use more of these examples. Thanks.
Great, thanks. Sorry to cut you off.
No, that's okay.
Yeah, and in terms of relevancy, I think we found ourselves in sort of overwhelming areas of relevance. It's hard to keep up with first the pandemic stuff, and now Black Lives Matter and social justice, and there's so much stuff to try to keep up to, which is great, but it's a challenge. So you probably didn't notice I was gone, but my internet picked a very awkward time to completely crash in the entire neighborhood, but I'm sure you guys just carried on and didn't even notice. And so trying not to miss a beat here, moving right to our second presentation, which is Anne-Michelle Marsden from Rutgers University, who is going to speak about teaching workplace social justice online, recommendations for engagement.
Okay, let me share my screen here, okay? Okay. Now we tried this out. Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay. I want to thank you, John, for being so kind as I was moving through getting ready to go online today. And also, Johanna, I really appreciate your help in the past. I really do appreciate it. And I really enjoyed listening to Johanna, because some of the issues that she addresses, I also address in my courses. What I want to do is that I want to start my timer. There we go. And my presentation focuses basically on teaching social justice, the concepts associated with social justice online, and focusing on engagement. Engaging assignments, and then also faculty engagement. Now, okay, before I begin, I want to give some orientation, because I am usually the diverse person in the room here. When we talk about LER, teaching and learning, I want to just put some perspective on this. I have not stood in a face-to-face classroom since 2003, when a PowerPoint slide set wasn't even a thing yet. I have been developing an expertise on online teaching and have taught online for 18 years. My full teaching load, so that's 4 courses a semester. My courses are asynchronous. They're delivered 100% online using the Canvas LMS. They were originally developed for this, for online. They have not been transferred online, although I've helped many faculty members do that. I have authored 8 online courses, but in this presentation, specifically on social justice issues, I am looking at diversity at work, religion in work, and the inclusive workplace. And I am quite a proponent for student-centered learning. Now, in case that's not a concept that you work with on a regular basis, basically, I take core concept learning and integrate it into customized and personalized learning. They have control over their learning process, and the online learning venue encourages all of those things that I have on this slide. I have two realities, and Johanna was talking about her audience, her students, and that's important for me too, to understand the student background on entering these courses. My school, the School of Management and Labor Relations, is divided into two parts, HR, and then those other people, the labor people, the union people. I'm one of those. So I teach from a social justice perspective. I have highly demographically and also ideologically diverse students. I have very few LER majors, only 20%. So I'm teaching students who do not have those core principles coming into the class. And my master's level classes are about 15% from my department, or 50%. Also, the issue is time dedicated to learning. That's not something that people who teach on in a face-to-face venue think about because they know they've got 3 hours and students will do so much work outside of it. Well, Rutgers University collects the data. I happen to know how much time students actually work in my courses, total. And that's basically 3 hours a week for undergraduate and 3.75. So I need to have my engagement front and center. So students in the small amount, think about that. 3 hours, that's what you have in front of, that they're in front of you. Then they go out and do, let's say, 2 hours worth of work. I only get them for this much time. All right. So that's my perspective. Now, what I'm going to do is talk about, after 20 years of working with this, what are the engaging assignments and activities? And I will note that any of these can be used in hybrid situations as well. I'm going to start with the polls. I don't know if any of you use polls inside your class. Oh, I'm also going to use quotes from my students. I went back and looked in the student evaluations for the last couple of years and saw what most students talked about. So that's how I picked what I was going to talk about. These polls are given before students even begin to be presented with the core concepts. So this is religion and work. Some of them I use I have a video, right? I publish what their poll results are, and I talk on a video about that concept so that they can see, well, where do I fit in and how did I answer and how did the class answer? I also use these so that I can have students think about things. This one talks about, you know, businesses should enjoy the same First Amendment religious freedoms that are provided to U.S. individuals. And 55% of the class in fall 19 said, yeah. Of course, when I asked them, gave them an example of a business working on their religious beliefs in policies, they said, oh, no, 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 no. They should be forced to. And of course, this is the provision of birth control in the healthcare packages. So I'm able to work with them on their critical thought and also introduce the concepts. Finally, I get to know who's walking in my class. If I have 49%, obviously haven't considered systemic oppression if they buy into the mediocrity. Meritocracy, and that people get what they deserve no matter who they are. They just need to work hard enough. So I know who's coming into my class. Okay, I have many different case studies. By the way, I have no textbooks in my classes. I use information that's online. I use readings that are in the library for free, the Rutgers library for free. And my courses are very fluid. They change constantly. So there's not a textbook and we go through chapter 1, 2, and 3. Here's an excellent case study. If you do teach about diversity and particularly about discrimination, this is an excellent case study. There is egregious sexual harassment and other gender-based and racial-based overt discrimination, and there is no happy ending. But this engages the students for at least 55 minutes when they're listening to this. Then they write about it, and they have 2 parts they have to write about: reflection back on what we've worked on before, and then what are the compelling components of the course. Then they upload it right into a discussion area on the week that we talk about legal protection against employment discrimination. So they synthesize the week's material with the case study that they've just done. The next is a graduate level type case study where I use all what I call news and views, where I select about 35 different situations that were in the news in the last academic year. And the graduate students have to talk about the situation, any conclusions, the connection to course material, and then their opinion. And then each of them publishes that and they discuss it. Now, in what I just talked about, and what I'm with the discussions online, and what I'm about to talk about with the course programs that the students have to develop, collaborative learning is key. So here you see the value of the students working together, learning from each other, understanding, and that type of collaborative learning online is very important. It needs some development by the faculty member, but this is a critical element in either any of the information that's shared in forms or in the course projects. So let me get to student choice, because that's where people often say, oh, that's not something I have thought about doing. First of all, we go right in the beginning of the week for graduate students, and in the 3 weeks into the semester for undergraduate students, students decide, what do I really, really want to focus on in this semester? Remember, I'm going to talk to them about the core concepts. They're going to get that, and then they're going to apply those. There's two things my graduate students have to focus on. What do they want to do with their course project? And where are they going to show leadership in this course? And I'm going to talk about the leadership first. They pick, right in the beginning of the semester, which forums, which discussions they're going to lead. And and they get extra credit if they choose to lead 2 of them, by the way. These requirements are significant over what is usually required of a student in a discussion. I've highlighted those there. So these students, it's published who's going to be the leaders, and they know what they need to do. The second thing has to do with the course project. And here they get to choose one of 5 different dimensions of diversity. By the way, all these dimensions also have to do with intersectionality. So even if they take religion, it's religion and race and gender. It's, it's disability and race, or disability and gender. So they get paired with individuals who also have the same common interest that they want to focus on. They have to develop a template, or they work with a template and have to develop this course project. This part 1 briefing, that's really the part 1 of the course. Part 2 deals with the second part of the course. And they take all those course concepts and they research according to their focus for the semester. They also have more choice. The team decides on a special interest topic for 3. They say, out of all that we're working with here, what are we going to pull out and really focus on? They also have to develop the discussion questions, which they get published. Now, if they have an A or above, it gets published for all as a required reading and for all to discuss. But there's one more thing. Hold on. Guess who grades the assignments? So yes, I do grade 75% of the assignment, but an anonymous grader is given the responsibility to offer a peer review. And this is using a grading rubric. Now, what's the peer review and how does that assist in grading? In engagement. Well, for 10 weeks, they've been working on core concepts and their subject area, their topic area. Now they're required to consider those core concepts in relation to another learning community member's area of interest, some other team's area of interest. And then they can synthesize all the information when we finally get in the discussion. Now, I do something like this in all my undergraduate courses too, two things. Students are allowed to opt out of team assignments. Not all undergraduates are meant to work in teams. They also do not peer review each other's work. And finally, only about 40% of the projects are usually published for review. I'm not going to make any student read a horrible course project. You have to have A or above. Religion and work, more choice. They get to choose their topic for their paper, but they have to write an abstract, and then I approve it and get involved with what they're talking about or focusing on. Okay. Next, the portfolios. So we have the course concepts, we give them an activity, they have personal reflection. Obviously that ends in personal meaning and deeper meaning. Now you'll see that once again, lots of choice. Their portfolios, part 1 or part 2, are due different parts of the semester. I do give them when I think they should complete it, because that's when they're working with the subject matter. This is not a touchy-feely journal thing. These portfolios match the concepts that we're addressing, like assimilation, where they're talking about covering. And then I return back, well, tell me, do you think covering, using course material and in your thoughts, do you really think covering is a social justice issue? And if you think so, why? Okay, I'm going to end with 3 faculty engagement ideas if you're teaching online, even in a hybrid. When you walk into a classroom, you understand that you have to turn the lights on and everybody's got to come in, and then it becomes 3-dimensional. And LMS, learning LMS, is a flat situation. So you need to show your students your knowledge and your passion for the subject matter, because that is, as you know, because you teach, that engagement is infectious. It's required. You have to let students see you and hear you. I could talk for an entire session on how to put together good video segments, but my videos are not talking heads by any means. And then you have to be willing to hold those very difficult, critical conversations. And I would imagine when I get back in the fall, that we're going to have some of those critical conversations. You have to teach students how to talk about these critical issues, these issues that will be, because we have people that regularly engage in comments that would upset other students. We have to be able to identify that, not shame anyone, have it as a learning opportunity. All right. There you go.
Great. Thanks, Anne Michelle. Very stimulating. I'm sure a lot for us to think about and discuss towards the end of the session. But first, 2 more presentations. We're next going to turn to Peter Norlander, who's at Loyola in Chicago, and he's going to talk about going wide and digging deep, the current events case method.
Unmuted. So thank you very much. And it's been very interesting to hear what everyone is doing. And I appreciate all of these ideas. So I'm going to share some cases that I developed while teaching my employment relations course. And I should just say that, in teaching employment relations, mostly to human resources students, I consider the course, we covered labor relations and we cover union management negotiations. But I want to motivate a care and a concern for issues of social justice and efficiency and equity and voice and power in the workplace, including the non-union workplace. And so I'll give some examples of how I try to motivate interest in those. First, I would try to motivate interest in the abstract concepts and the wide areas that are, labor law, history, and theory, and just digging deep into a set of facts. So specific factual events that are relatively current. I have done this to encourage perspective taking and discussion in the class. So some of them are very short. I can hand them out in a single class period, 10 minutes to read it. and write your own comments, 10 minutes to discuss with a group, and then 10 minutes, not 10 minutes, but the rest of the class for group discussion, and then motivating, again, connecting that back to the larger issues in our reading and in the area. So this issue of, how do you apply concepts to fact patterns, that's part of what I'm trying to do here. I'm trying to, here's the fact pattern. What does this bring up for you? What issues is this bringing up that are in our reading that are relevant to discuss? And I'm presenting it here at ILERA, and thank you for this opportunity for those who made this possible, because I want to just distribute a few examples of cases that I've developed. I'd love to hear any feedback. I put my email address on the first slide, but I can do that in the chat box as well. I'd love to hear any feedback you have. I'd encourage anyone to use it. And I'm looking, and after the last, I had an opportunity to present this at LYRA as well. There are other scholars who do this in their classrooms, and they have their cases that they teach, and they provide students with a written handout of current events of a teacher's strike, or for example. And so this is a global community, and I hope that if anyone would be interested in collaborating in any way, we can touch base. So I will put the links in the chat box. I hope that these come through. If anybody has, I realize we don't have a discussion board for posting this later, but oops, those links did not work. Well, I'll post the links in a moment, but in any case, I'll tell you about the cases. So the first case is a short case. This is called Thomas Smith and the No Can Do. And it's about an employee at a Walmart in New York. He is a ex-convict, a Black man who was formerly homeless, is mentally disabled. He was earning $9 an hour, clearing carts from the parking lot. He picks up cans at the end of his shift from the parking lot and a few from inside the store, and he cashes them in at the machines, and he is then called to an interview with security, requested to sign a confession. He said he could not read or understand. He didn't have his glasses with him, and he was not allowed to bring any coworker, have anyone participate with him, or someone to advocate or be there for him. And he didn't want to violate his parole or involve the police. So he signed this document, and he was fired. This event led to a Black Friday protest. So in the United States, the day after Thanksgiving is typically a large shopping day, and there were protests outside of the store. This happened in the autumn. The Department of Labor in the state of New York and state legislators threatened investigations and action, and a lawsuit was threatened, a personal civil lawsuit. But essentially, that's the set of facts that students are given. And then the questions posed are, was it legal? Was it fair? Was it productive? And what should be done? This is typically one that I use in the earlier stages of the course. And we have an interesting discussion about this. The objectives are to begin introducing concepts like at-will employment, what that means, ban the box initiative. So the other part of this story I didn't mention was that the company had said that in his job application, he had not indicated that he had been in prison before applying to the job. So New York at the time had not had a ban the box, which would prohibit employers from asking employees about former convictions. And then introducing and motivating collective action. Even in a non-union context, you can see the effect of community and workers and society coming out, how it affected the store, the rights of workers to interviews in a non-union setting, and how security interviews are conducted, and a introduction, again, to the topic of employment discrimination. The next case, this one is a little bit longer. This is about Susan Fowler. She was an employee of Uber. She was a engineer who was sexually harassed on the job, complained to HR, and effectively HR was useless and even not helpful in any way. And it ultimately led to her resigning and quitting her position. And she goes on to become a national, so she writes a blog post on the Medium website, and that goes viral. And she becomes a national figure in the Me Too movement, a Woman of the Year as named by Financial Times and other media publications. And she files an amicus curiae brief in the NLRB versus Murphy Oil case, which is a matter related to the use of mandatory arbitration. So she could not sue her employer, despite being sexually harassed and probably retaliated against, because she had signed away that right at the time that she had joined her job. So how does a essentially rank and file engineer go into becoming a national figure and an advocate for workers' rights, someone who may not have initially thought that this employment labor relations field was all that relevant? In a matter of a couple of years, she becomes a national leader on issues of workers' rights. Questions that I ask students in this case: what are the sources of power that Uber and Fowler have respectively? Does social media level the playing field between employers and employees? That always creates an interesting discussion. Is justice served by mandatory arbitration clauses? And what role should HR play in an organization that suffers major failings from within? So that set of facts is in there. And I think I put my slides in the wrong order here, but this is the last case that I want to talk about. This is also one that I provide in the earlier stages of the quarter to really motivate the issue of power in the workplace. And so in the Silicon Valley wage fixing case, you can see Steve Jobs and the emails he exchanges with other leading CEOs of technology companies. And their behavior is essentially engaging in a conspiracy to suppress the job mobility of workers. And it, according to some estimates, cost workers billions of dollars in lost wages. Again, this is a non-union situation. The Justice Department did not prosecute a criminal or a civil antitrust case in this example. But the workers formed a class action lawsuit. A few of them got together and they took a lawsuit to federal court and eventually won a few $100 million, small compared to the potential losses here, but essentially showing how, for much of the non-union sector, are rights enforced and the onus it places upon employees and the issue of class versus individual lawsuits. So the discussion questions I have focus on issues of power and justice and efficiency. Who are the actors, again, analyzing that power relationship? What resources are at stake? What strategic decisions do the actors make? Justice questions: is the outcome fair? Was the company's conduct ethical? What's the law and what should be done? And efficiency questions: was the action of each individual company profit maximizing? Was the collective result of each company's action efficient from an economic perspective? And are class action lawsuits an efficient way of resolving disputes? So learning objectives for each of these, I define them in advance and I make sure that I touch upon, if they're not brought up, how the case connects, again, back to a theory or a law or issue that we're, a concept that we're covering in our reading. And I try to, as others have said, when the field is constantly changing, there are always new examples and good examples that come up. I've taught the LaDonna case as well, assigning that to students to listen to beforehand, and then we come in. We have really excellent discussions on all of that. So I appreciate the time and the opportunity to share these. I will send the links, and thank you so much for any feedback or any interest in more case studies. Thanks.
Thanks, Peter. That was great. Great to see the willingness to share and contribute to the community here. Looks like a lot of rich issues for students to really discuss with contemporary issues. Our fourth and final presentation is by Douglas McCabe, who is a professor at Georgetown University, and his topic is integrating labor and employment relations and collective bargaining into negotiation modules.
John, I'm going to do this the old-fashioned way like John Hausman used to do. in the finance commercials. I do not have PowerPoints, so I will merely be speaking without PowerPoints. I feel very strongly about this topic, very strongly about this topic of integrating traditional IR into courses in business schools. My focus will be on business schools, not on institutes of industrial relations. Going back to our early discussions, I just want to make this editorial comment. I feel that the AASB made a big mistake not to require HR as a common core course in business school curriculums rather than OB, because OB taught by 99.9% of professors across the United States do not cover any of the topics that we've been discussing for the last hour or so. I think that was a strategic mistake, and perhaps the Old Industrial Relations Research Association is not active enough in that area. So let me begin. I teach also occasionally the HR course at Georgetown, which is a required course at the undergraduate level for our management majors. And at the MBA level, we have an elective. And unfortunately, the enrollment in that has been going down. So where is the action in business schools, and how can we get this IR material into business school curriculums? Well, like elsewhere, my traditional my traditional labor relations course, way back in 2005, probably back in the Stone Age now, all right, died a very slow death due to lack of enrollment. And at the time, my department chair says, Doug, let's come up with another course. And we were thinking about establishing a negotiations course in our undergraduate curriculum, and then also in our MBA curriculum. So right now at Georgetown, we have a full semester undergraduate course in negotiations, which I teach, and our MBA courses are half semester courses, and I teach those courses also at the same time, because our teaching load here is basically 4 courses per year. So when I designed the negotiation courses, each course had 1/3 of it dealing with business and commercial negotiations. Each course had 1/3 dealing with international and cross-cultural negotiations. And then I put into the module labor negotiations and alternative dispute resolution as the 1/3 of the course. I did not know at the time how that was going to resolve itself. Well, guess what? The course exploded in popularity. All right, it's one of the most popular electives at the MBA level here at Georgetown, and also one of the most popular electives at our undergraduate level. So I begin the course, all right, using Walter McCursey's models and their behavioral science, behavioral theory of negotiations, all right? And then I have simulations in the first third on business and commercial, and then I have simulations in the second third of the course on cross-cultural and international negotiations. Now, here's the part that's important. In the third part of the negotiations course, I put in there all of the traditional material, of course condensed in a very finite form, of what might be called traditional labor relations, traditional IR, substantive material. Within that section, that 1/3 section of the course, all right, I do a labor relations negotiations, where I break the students into teams to prep them and negotiate a real life labor negotiations case. I also show a great DVD, The Suspension of Nurse Kevin, out of Penn State. And the reaction is unbelievable. The intellectual debate and dialogue on that case study is superb. They debate whether Nurse Kevin got justice or not. So within that third section, we look at issues of worker voice, justice, fairness, and equity in the employment relationship, mediation, arbitration, and labor negotiations. Now, here is what is fascinating. Among both our MBA students, who are all concerned about getting jobs in finance and consulting, and likewise with our undergraduate students who are concerned with getting jobs in finance and consulting, I have found that the vast majority of them, all right, in both programs, believe in the principles of justice, equity, and voice as espoused by unions. They are in favor of those principles. So to make a long story short, I think that in business schools, that if you incorporate traditional IR labor relations material into it, the course, it will be totally well received. That's my empirical observation here at Georgetown. All right, the MBAs and undergraduates, yes, they love talking about business negotiations. They love talking about cross-cultural and international negotiations, but they love the rock and roll element of labor negotiations. So that's been my experience, at least, and I think it can be a successful utilization of other professors like us around the United States in business schools.
Great, thank you. Always good to hear positive stories where we can increase our enrollment and engagement rather than the reverse trend. So with that, we now have a half hour to ask questions of the presenters, talk with each other, share our own ideas. I'm happy to have people in the audience start off with this. You can indicate to me in the chat that you'd like to ask something, or you can, if you go to the participant list, down at the bottom of the participant list, there should be a raise hand button that you can use. Or there's not too many of us, so if you just want to unmute yourself and speak, I don't think it will be chaos at this point. Anybody in the audience? Okay, well, I can start. I'm sure I wasn't the only one who noticed in Anne Michelle's presentation that students were only spending 3 or 3 3/4 of an hour total per week on the material or on the course. I know this, you probably don't want this to be the focus of the takeaway. I know you had a lot, other things that were very rich we could think about, but I was just maybe thinking you could speak about that a little more in terms of, is that just the norm that online instructors are powerless to fight? Can you enforce more, or can you say some more about that?
Certainly, and I took the slide out that really showed the graphs on this because I didn't want it to be the focus. But let me make 2 points. The first one being, what I didn't focus on is the amount of time that students are tending to their studies outside of that 3 hours that you have them in a classroom, that's also decreasing. So it's not just my experience that it's decreasing. Now, that information can't be used really across the board, because what Rutgers does is this is per course. So these are all of my courses as that we can compare to all of the in-person courses. So those numbers are really in my department. How often are they studying? How many hours are they studying? And compared to my online courses. Now, can I do something about it? Well, that's part of the engagement focus. Am I concerned about this? Yes, and I didn't show the graphic, but it gets lower than 3.5. There's some classes in some semesters that it's 2.5, believe it or not. So, you know, now, but the graduates, you start to see, okay, you know, it's increasing now. I have tried, and what you get is a mutiny. I pay for it by having students who are disgruntled. And I pay for it by hearing students say, you know, I don't know what you expect from me. I'm taking 5 classes and working on time, full time. And of course, my first thing I say is, oh, how's that working for you? Because that's impossible. They're expecting something that's impossible, especially when they're online courses, when they're very involved and you know, they have to watch videos and read material and do activities, and they don't have somebody that's leading them the whole time, whether it's a group situation. So I've tried, and what I've found is that I just really have to work with that amount of time. And that those courses that have, I watch those numbers. I don't know if other online professors watch those numbers too. There's several faculty members in my department that primarily teach online as well. They offer an in-person course here or there, but like me, they teach online. I don't know if they look at those numbers, but I've watched them over many years. And I can only focus on what I can get them to do, because they really have, students really understand, especially in online course, which I don't get that disconnect, that they are the consumer of this and that I need to work with their time availability. So me stamping and stomping my feet is not going to really make them work longer. However, I can make them work in a more meaningful way, which is a time on an assignment, on a task, working in teams, doing this and that. They can't just not show up for this development of a team presentation. So that's my answer.
Great.
And I'm concerned too.
Yeah, but I guess it really does force you to really think carefully about what's the greatest priority and how can you get the deepest learning in the most efficient way.
Correct.
Johanna, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, just a question for the group. Maybe it's sort of a bigger political question, because I mean, we all have agency, academic freedom in our own classes, but you know, I'm just really interested in your experience, Doug, and maybe the others can chime in too, and you too, John. But you know, in terms of trying to change the content of existing courses that may not be yours, and or kind of advocating within your unit for new courses. I'm just, you know, curious about people's experiences with that and what approaches or arguments might be persuasive, or I don't know. I mean, it's a sensitive topic, right? You can't just be like, your course sucks, you should put this in it. But just, I don't know, just like what role do we play? And I suppose those of us who are less embedded in really core IR programs and more situated out in spaces where we have to perhaps advocate. I would just be interested in people's reflections on how we get more.
I can make a comment on that if it's okay.
Yeah, that'd be great.
I had been academic, this is Stephen Havlovic from Laurentian. I had served as a dean provost at several different universities and returned to teaching last year. And I noticed that the cases in the prior course material was a bit flat, as you were suggesting. So I found the use of experiential learning and group discussions to be important, but bringing in the videos, I took that Uber scenario that was mentioned by one of the presenters earlier and read it to the class, and the case was flat on Uber, and they knew about issues with the drivers. They had no idea the systemic discrimination that was going on within the headquarters. Similar with Arthur Anderson, Ford Firestone, a number of these cases, and like Doug was talking about, you know, doing the bargaining simulation, it seemed like the learning was just exponential when we took it beyond the standard script that some of the professors tend to do. But you're right, it's hard to get some people to make that shift. They just want to use more of the static cases without bringing in these other materials. So that's just what I was going to add. It seemed to like these interaction pieces. I was intrigued by the self-grading piece. The only time I've done peer evaluations of like bargaining teams, but I can see where those types of items could be very powerful as well.
Thank you. Anybody else have any magic solutions for Johanna?
This is Pete here, and I would try to get on the committees. At Loyola, I was fortunate to be able to serve on a curriculum development committee for the new MBA program, and we are working on redesigning the HROB course. And so for MBA students, we're going to have a lot of the same negotiation material, material related to issues of justice and equity and efficiency in the workplace. So if you see those opportunities when they do come up, and you know, with uncertainty out there, this is a potentially good time to revisit, you know, what belongs in front of MBA students in a program, or MSHR or other audiences for this community, because what everyone here does is so important and connected to real issues and the laws and the institutions that govern these systems.
So I'll also jump in, and since this is being recorded, you know, this is all just hypothetical, of course, not talking about anyone specifically, but, you know, I think in terms of, you know, faculty committees or peers, right? I think faculty outside our areas can have, you know, the same kind of simplistic, outdated visions of the field that students have, right? And, you know, unions are dead, and this used to be something useful, but nobody's actually unionized anymore, right? And so I think we can think about, you know, the way in which we make things engaging and relevant for students in terms of, you know, it's not just about, well, how do you get somebody to sign a card check or whatever, right? But it's about, you know, the issues, for example, Johanna, you started with in terms of citizenship and collectivism and power and things like that. Right, I think those arguments can be persuasive with our colleagues as well, but I think we have to make them and think about them in the same way as we do as sort of a student-facing front, and, you know, and demonstrate to our colleagues, you know, how we're bringing in, what, you know, what we're bringing in that's of more importance, of broader importance than simply, right, how do you resolve a grievance or something. And, you know, and we can bolster that by, you know, in the US, it's easy to think about, well, you know, unions only represent 5% of the workforce, or, you know, approaching that in the private sector. But if you look at the fraction of our graduates who are going to be working in a unionized organization at some point, right, it's much, much bigger than that. So again, I would just sort of think about the same way in which we're trying to think about these issues for students. Let's not assume that our peers, you know, sort of already understand and have a deeper understanding already. Anybody else on this or
John,
other
I'll jump
issues?
in. I couldn't find my little raise hand
Okay.
item. This is Rob Hickey from Queens, and Johanna. The one thing that I see in your case is you're kind of in a unique position where you're at. You're not in the business school. You have one IR course, so I think that makes it more difficult. But I would also imagine that many universities, and I think Western would be the same, of developing a lot more focus on experiential learning and problem-based learning, and certainly Western's tradition in the business school with their production of cases, right? I would just imagine that you would have a very receptive, broader context and environment to work with. At Queens, we had a unique opportunity because we're a small unit that's focused on IR. We're not in the business school. We just moved into the arts and science faculty. And so we have a lot of kind of autonomy to shape things. And with 5 faculty members, we can usually get 3 of us going in the same direction at any given moment. So, but I would look, and I've just started to look at Queens for leveraging some of the Center for Teaching and Learning on experiential learning resources for our students. It's been a good way to kind of shift the culture in the unit.
Anybody in the audience have other questions? You know, again, we're a small group. You can just unmute yourself and talk. I don't think you need to hunt around for the raise hand button. Otherwise, so I'll ask another question of Anne Michelle. You mentioned, you know, so sort of looking ahead for a number of us who haven't been online instructors, and we're not going to be online instructors in terms of, you know, fully asynchronous and everything else, but, you know, we're going to be doing a lot of remote learning, at least for this fall, if not further into the future. And so, you know, you closed with a lot of recommendations that could be more general. And one of the things you mentioned was, you know, your videos aren't just talking head videos, I think.
Yeah.
Could you speak a little bit more about that? What suggestions do you have for the rest of us who are faced with this new challenge in our teaching career?
I'd love to. And the first thing I'll say is I am no technical wizard. So what I'm about to say, I did right on my own screen. Now, I will indicate that Rutgers has an absolutely wonderful recording studio. It's a personal recording studio. You don't have anybody putting powder on you. You do it yourself. But I do record some of those core concepts that are the talking head parts. So my recommendations for the non-talking head parts is that there is an ability for you in PowerPoint to go in to capture 4 minutes, 3 minutes of the crux of a TED Talk, or a news reel that's talking about a particular, something that's in the news that can start some discussion. So not only do I use my talking head, but I use clips from other things, and I am able to do some voiceovers for some particular lists, something that students are used to pizzazz. And so they're just not going to stick with us for a long time unless you engage them. And engagement is often, we're moving quickly. We're moving on. Now, sometimes people split that into different small videos, which of course is one way to do it. As far as I'm concerned, that requires more work of me. So I would rather put 3 different concepts that I know they're going to use together in one. But those are the things that I would use. I would find other materials that you want to put in there. I would highlight, I would talk about case studies in there with a voiceover. I would clip other pieces out there where legal that you can use along with you talking. And of course, the point that I married to that is to make sure that students feel your knowledge, feel your passion for this topic, because you're not in front of them at that time. Like all of you, compel your students. You have to do it differently. And I have found, because I've worked with a lot of faculty, and I just looked to make sure nobody was on this that I've helped in my own faculty, but people put a camera in front of you, and I don't know what happens to you guys. I'm telling you, I just really don't know what happens, because all of that I know can be shared somehow just gets lost in the ether in a recording studio. I don't know if you have to have a student on the other side or what you need, but it has to be something like you're talking to them personally, not that you get a videotape of you talking on the stage. That does nothing. That just requires them to recognize, oh, I'm not taking a course that I'm going to see this person standing in front of me. So being personable, being humorous, showing them your anger about a situation, or your joy, or contemplating, and all of what you do in front of your students now, you need to do in those videotapes. They can't just be a talking head, 5-minute talking head of the main concept.
Great, thanks. Any audience questions? I have a question for Doug. So Doug, were you teaching this past spring, and did you have to do the magic pivot, the dreaded P word? And how did the negotiations go remotely? Any suggestions for the rest of us who are facing that in the future?
Yeah, Georgetown went online totally in the middle of March. And we all moved and used Zoom. And it went very well, because on Zoom, you can put the students into breakout rooms. So they can prepare individually in their own breakout room. Then you can have a one-on-one negotiation, or in a group simulation of 3 versus 3, they can prep in the same room as a team, and then you can get both teams together. It works negotiation can work well with Zoom, with great utilization of the breakout room features.
Sort of a very detailed logistical question was it cumbersome getting the right roles to the right people? How did you handle that?
I got to know the people fairly well. So in all honesty, I wanted to break up the teams pretty evenly. So I assigned them to a particular role beforehand. One group or one individual would receive the secret information. The other group or individual would receive the secret information. They prep, and then I put them together to negotiate.
And you just emailed that to them, or?
Yes, over our Canvas system. So don't be afraid to use Zoom and breakout rooms for negotiations. It works out okay. And as long as COVID-19 is going to be around, I think some of us who teach negotiations will have to continue to be online virtually.
I
John,
would second the breakout. Sorry, Doug?
I have a question for everyone. As I mentioned in my short presentation, I have found that the vast majority of students are in tune with the principles of labor relations as enunciated by unions. To quote John Budd, justice, fairness, equity, what have you. These are even MBA students. Have the other people found that to be the case? Or are your students notoriously anti-union or not?
Peter, you want to start?
Thank you. Sure. I would say most students without experience personally with the union are more ignorant of the state of our laws and affairs and the role of unions than I had. I had worried my first year I wouldn't have anything to teach, but I quickly found out that there's a lot that people don't know. And so in John Budd's book, for example, in the textbook, I think there is an example of, what Americans' beliefs about the workplace are and what the laws actually are. And when I present the Thomas Smith case, people are shocked. They think, how can this happen? How is this legal? And I use that as a motivator to start getting people interested in how does the system actually work. I'll also say on online negotiations, I've run Zinnia, which is an excellent negotiation exercise online. I've done it in person, and it works great online. It works well in person, and that's my experience.
I can make a comment if you don't mind.
Sure.
I taught collective bargaining this last semester, and like Doug, I had to switch to online. I had caucus rooms and negotiation rooms for 2 contracts set up in the library. And then they've been meeting for 3 weeks in bargaining preparation, but right before they had the first actual negotiation, we had a case of coronavirus on a staff worker on campus, and we just were shut down and switched. But I would say in terms of where they came from, it was a mix of business students and labor studies students, and regardless of where they were coming from, it was a 3rd-year course. They knew at least Ontario Canadian labor law. They knew respect. So some of them came from union families that were very union, more socialist oriented. Some wanted to be entrepreneurs, but wanted to be respectful of workers and be in a position to negotiate. But with all that said, it's an elective course and not required. So I think that played into the sentiment. They had to sign up. But unlike Doug, I had problems the first night with doing 2 contracts. I didn't realize I couldn't host 2 at once, and I didn't have a co-host. So I lost half of the bargaining on kickoff, and I was bouncing back and forth, and they had to have another professor come in to co-host one of the negotiations. And the second week I knew to have a student co-host so it would run without me. But I did have problems on the breakouts where I set them up ahead of time, and then that seemed to disappear. So the co-host had to reset them up for me. So I did have some tech problems. But other than that, there was a lot of respect. The students knew there was a penalty for strikes and or lockouts, and they worked it hard in good faith, and it was a very positive experience.
Yeah, I would say, and I think most of my students, the weird thing at Western is that, so we have the business school, the Ivy School of Business, but they don't have a direct entry. So you have to do 2 years in another undergraduate program before you can get access to the Honors Business Administration of Ivy. So because we're sort of the management program, we're sometimes seen as a feeder for Ivy. Although, I mean, we teach 3,000 students and about 100 of them go to Ivy a year. So it's, it's not overwhelming, but I think by the time they get to, say, my course, they've made a choice about whether they want to be at the business school or they want to be somewhere else. And so I think that influences the mindset of the students that I end up seeing. But I'd agree with your observation, Doug, that for the most part, when they get talking, and Peter, your observation too, when they get into the issues, they see the core of those things, and I think they're quite good at seeing them through what would be their own lens. Like, if this was happening to me or my friend or my family member, I would approach it differently. And I guess it's really just providing an opportunity for students to see the content that way instead of always seeing the content from the other side, right? Like, as an employee who comes to you and you have to solve this problem of the employee, allowing them and giving them the space to see it from that other perspective, they quite readily jump on board with the need for equity and fairness and all that kind of stuff.
Johanna, amen.
Yeah, I've had the same experience too, and the only thing I would add to that is, not only do they, you need to. I've had more success, right, getting them to see it, through their own lens, rather than through the lens of a problem that needs to be solved, or the part I was going to add, or as through the lens of an institution where they've been brought up with sort of ossified views, right? And you can sort of work them to that point, but you start with sort of what, how would you like to be treated? Do you want some input into how things are done, et cetera? Yeah. Anybody have any final comments? And Michelle?
One of the things I wanted to note, particularly when we were talking about OB not having any IR focus, is how we've handled this within our school, which is, it is amazing to me how, and this is about to start in fall, so I don't know how this is going to go. But there were two courses, the organizational behavior and the diversity in work. And of course, we all teach it from those of us who teach it either in person or online, teach it from a social justice perspective and a employee perspective, where of course HR teaches both of the OB and the diversity at work from a management perspective. And so what they've done is they're going to just allow students to take, they gave us all one new number. So all of the way that OB is being taught, either from my department or through the HR department, is under one number, and any of our students from either of those two majors can take that. And so the student now decides, what perspective do I want to take this course through? Am I going to take it through the management perspective, or am I going to take it through the labor perspective? And that's for diversity and inclusion and for organizational behavior. And both of those courses I have developed an online course and are the main person that teaches those online, and mine are from the IR perspective. So I just wanted to mention how we've worked that out in our school.
The real question will be, do students really choose on the basis of perspective, or do they choose on the basis of time?
Well, I think that most students, unless they're, we have an online program. We have a degree giving online program in labor studies, and it's for individuals who are finishing their degree. So they come in, and often union individuals that come to finish their degree. And so that's one group of people. The people that are primarily taking either the in-person or online versions of the courses that I just mentioned, they don't consciously think about the time. They just do what they do. I just happen to have data that shows me what they do.
Yeah,
They're not taking it because they think that they'll have to spend less time on it. We make sure they understand that this is a true commitment when you're online. This is not a plaything. You have to work.
Did you consider the possibility of joint teaching from the two perspectives to see if that helps students get a better handle on the material?
Boy, is that beyond my pay grade. This was made at the dean's level, and in fact, if we have to be real about this, that we are not even going to get any of the financial support that we get back from students enrolling in this course, because now there's this new dean's division. It's not even a number that's associated with our department. And so I'm not sure that, that given the relationship between those two departments, that might have occurred. But that was the solution, so that we have a management perspective and a labor perspective. I'm certainly not changing mine, and they're not going to change their OB. Neither of us are going to change. So I don't know. I don't know why that didn't happen. I don't know if, and of course, I could do that. Now that you say that, maybe I will. So what I do is I integrate someone that's from the HR department and make some tapes with them, do some joint assignments with them, and put that online. I could do that. That's an excellent idea.
Next year, we'll have to hear all about how it went and where you're moving to. Okay, so by my clock, we are out of time. Don't mean to cut off a productive discussion, but there are additional sessions starting in another 15 minutes. So I want to thank all the panelists for very thoughtful presentations, giving a lot of us things to think about and reasons for hope. And if people want to continue this conversation, there's going to be another session tomorrow. Also around teaching innovations, new panelists, and that's in the time slot before this one. So I think that's 1:45 Eastern time tomorrow. So maybe I'll see some of you there. Otherwise, I hope to see some of you in other sessions. And thanks again to the presenters.
Thanks, John. Nice to meet everybody.
Nice to meet you. Thank you, John.